time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming along. Today's presentation is on Burnie. Now, I'm often asked where Tasmania is, and is it actually part of Australia? Well, I can understand there might be some confusion because CNN doesn't really know. They've got Queensland showing up down there. But then again, they don't know where anywhere is. Of course. But to set the sacred record straight, yes, Tasmania is, of course, part of Australia, despite how much everyone might like to think otherwise. Tas is an island about 240 kilometres south of the mainland, separated by the waters of the Bass Strait. It covers an area of about 65,000 square kilometres, and it's about 364 kilometres from the north to the south and 306 kilometres from east to west. But as well as being an island, Tassie, because that's what we call it here, is also a state, making it Australia's only island state. It's also the 26th largest island in the world. And because I know somebody's going to ask me who the other 25 are, there they are. And that. Okay, so it is, I did count them, there are 26 on there. There's always been a feeling of us and them when it comes to Australia, and this is how the good folks in Tasmania see the world from their perspective. Tasmania is more than just the main island. It comes with 334 smaller surrounding islands. The most southern of its islands are the Bishop and Clark Islets, and they are the southernmost terrestrial point of the state of Tasmania and Australia's southernmost internationally recognised piece of land. And then the next landmass after Tassie is 2,500 kilometres away. It's about 1,600 miles, and that's the great white continent of Antarctica. Hobart, the capital of the state of Tasmania, is recognised gateway to the Antarctic. It's home for the port, the scientific research ships that ply the waters of the Bass Strait or the Southern Ocean between Hobart and Antarctica. And Hobart International Airport provides the Antarctic link to Wilkins Runway at Casey Station down there. Now, Tasmania was in fact once attached to the mainland. That was millions of years ago when Australia was part of the supercontinent Gondwana. But when Gondwana began splitting up and Australia drifted away, Tasmania was still attached at the time, so we didn't have any other option. We had to bring them with us. But at the end of the Ice Age, when the sea levels became rising again, they flooded the sort of land bridge between the mainland and Tasmania, forming the waters of what's now the Bass Strait, permanently separating Tasmania from Australia, from the mainland. See, do it again, we keep thinking they're not part of Australia, much to the delight of those folks down in Tasmania. Now, in 2017, it was reported in a National Geographic article that the locals in Devonport, which is a small town not too far from Burnie, claimed that they thought the mainland seemed to be a bit further away from Tasmania than usual. Now, according to the National Geographic article, they were right, something to do with ongoing continental drift. And then the article went on to explain that it was projected that in 40 years, Tasmania would have drifted out to sea altogether, and possibly even ended up in an ownership dispute between Australia and New Zealand. And they listed some fairly bizarre solutions to anchor it down so that it stayed in place. And when it was beginning to seem quite logical and became quite worrying, they printed the date of the article that they printed there as the 1st of April. And I won't show you the comments that were posted on Facebook from people who actually believed this. Now, the mainlanders do consider the folks down in Tassie to be somewhat different. It's hard to say who's more responsible for keeping this ongoing image of them being slightly different from us. The mainlanders or the good folks from Tassie themselves, but they keep this joke going all the time. The deep waters around Tasmania are home to some of the ugliest fish on the planet. This blobfish, and I know you think I'm making this up, but I'm not. The worrying part is these things do actually exist. But this is not another National Geographical article. So if you're looking for some less conventional Australian souvenirs to take back to your grandchildren, or the neighbour looking after your pot plants, there's a little blobfish paperweight here. Tasmania promotes itself as a totally natural state. About 42% of its land area is protected national parks, large rugged wilderness in the middle, and the World Heritage sites like Cradle Mountain. In the 1970s, Tasmania was the founding place of the first environmental party in the world, the Tasmanian Greens, or just the Greenies as we call them. They formed in the 70s over the proposed Franklin River Dam. It was a project to build a dam on the Gordon River To generate hydroelectricity to supply the area, which seemed like a reasonable idea, the dam would have impacted upon the environmentally sensitive Franklin River. So the newly formed Greenies political party rallied and demonstrated, and they stood their ground, and the dam was never built. One of the causes they have embraced today, though, is respecting the Aborigines' rights, but it's pretty much you name it, and they'll save it for you. And this Tassie is renowned for its lavender farms, mainly in the south, but during this season, the farms are covered in purple, really bright purple, making the countryside quite spectacular. And there's lots of lavender items for sale in the souvenir shops around here, and it's quite amazing what you can actually use lavender for. Poppy farming has been going on since the 1960s, growing poppies for medicinal purposes, not recreational purposes. And the poppy straw is refined into opiates like morphine and codeine. And Tasmania produces 60% of the world's morphine, and the crops here are very heavily guarded, as you can imagine. But unfortunately, the wildlife can't read the signs. And those poppies look like pretty good snacks to the kangaroos. And they've been jumping the fences for a bit of a nibble. And the unfortunate result of them getting stoned, and some have been reported as getting high as kites, hopping around out of control, creating crop circles. So welcome Tasmania, and that's it from an Australian Tasmanian's point of view. So a little bit about the place itself. The Dutch explorer Abel Tasman is the name linked with the island of Tasmania. He was the first reported European to sight the land in 1642. When he was 33, he signed up with the Dutch East India Company, and he headed off on several voyages to the Far East. His mission was to find the great southern continent, or the elusive Terra Australis Incognita, that had been eluding European explorers for centuries. The fine print on his contract or his mission said that he was to take possession of other continents or islands that he discovered along the way, because none of these islands were expected to have a sovereign. Taking possession simply meant, as it did in those days, planting a flag on the beach or erecting a memorial stone. Although you were actually expected, or he was expected to do a little bit of exploring whilst he was there. But off he went on the first of several epic voyages to find this great southern continent. He headed southwest into previously uncharted waters, and with them he had two vessels, the Heemskerk and the Zeehan. And in 1642, he noticed in his journal that his compasses were behaving oddly. Somehow he came to the conclusion that what was causing the fluctuations in his compass was the presence of lodestone on a nearby shore. A lodestone, you may not know or may know, is a naturally magnetized piece of mineral magnetite, and unbeknown to him, this was the first prediction of the existence of mineral wealth off the west coast of Tasmania. So he charted a course south, skirting the southern end of Tasmania. His plan was to follow the east coast northward as far as it went to see where it went. But before he got too much further, his ship was hit with the trade winds, or the roaring 40s, howling up from the Bass Strait, like they did when we were on Kangaroo Island, if you remember. The roaring 40s are a global wind current that blows around the Earth at latitude 40 to 50 degrees. And Tasmania sits at 44 degrees latitude, putting it directly in the path of these notorious winds. The strong winds greatly affect the weather patterns in the far northwest of Tassie, to the advantage of some of the thrill seekers, and also to the Sydney-Hobart yacht race that takes advantage of these winds. Either he hadn't read the fine print in his mission about exploring the lands he found along the way, or he didn't want to deal with the winds, but for whatever reason, instead of investigating the coastline of Tasmania, he abruptly turned away to the east and continued continent hunting in totally the wrong direction. Now, as an afterthought, he named the coastline he was leaving behind as Anthuch van Diemenschland, after the governor of the Dutch East Indies. And then he ordered his carpenter to swim through the heavy surf and plant a Dutch flag on the beach. So whilst technically he took possession of the land on the 3rd of December 1642, he didn't actually explore it, and that didn't go unnoticed by the Dutch East Indian, his bosses. Tasman made a second voyage out this way, searching for the eastern side of New Holland, but somehow he got confused in the Torres Strait between New Guinea and Australia, and he continued sailing westward, mapping the north and west coast. From the point of view of the Dutch East India Company, his explorations were somewhat disappointing. He hadn't found the great southern continent, and his bosses were unimpressed. He hadn't taken time to fully explore the lands that he had found along the way, like Van Diemen's Land. So that was pretty much the end of his career with the Dutch East Indian Company. And this very difficult name that was too difficult for anybody who wasn't Dutch to pronounce was ultimately changed to the English version of just Van Diemen's Land. And then eventually to Tasmania in order of Tasman himself. And in 1808, London-based map makers included a map with both names, and that was the first appearance of Tasmania discovered in print. Tasmania wasn't explored by Europeans again for over a century, although the mainland was briefly visited from time to time, but usually only by accident. Like Captain Bligh was a good example of the Royal Navy. He stopped briefly to take on fresh water before going on to Tahiti, and we know how that trip ended up. So up to this time, nobody had actually realized that Tasmania was in fact an island, until the great man himself, Captain Cook, arrived on board the Endeavour. He was the first one to realize that Tasmania was not a peninsula, and in fact it was an island, separated from the mainland by the Bass Strait. But he was under strict orders from the British Admiralty to hide all strategically important discoveries, like offshore islands and so on, for which operations could be mounted by hostile powers. And you have to remember that this was at the height of the Anglo-French rivalry. So Cook disguised his discovery in his journal with a riddle, and on the chart he drew a curtain across the channel, and by sketching a false coastline, this ploy worked, as Europe's map makers continued to depict Tasmania as a peninsula of the mainland, suppressing the truth for another 3 decades. The mystery about whether Van Diemen's Land was a peninsula or an island was eventually dispelled when George Bass and Matthew Flinders circumnavigated the entire coastline of Tassie. When news of their discovery of Bass Strait reached Europe, the French government immediately dispatched Nicolas Baudin, and you remember that name from one of the other lectures, in command of a French reconnaissance expedition. And this prompted the Governor-King of New South Wales to send 2 British vessels to establish a garrison in Hobart. It was becoming like a big nautical game of chess being played out between France and Britain in the South Pacific. But in reality, the English hadn't actually claimed Tasmania at the time. They had only really claimed the east coast of Australia. So a young John Brewer sent an urgent dispatch to London requesting permission to establish an English settlement in Tasmania. Impatient for an answer, he decided not to wait any longer, and he took off on board the Lady Nelson, 24 convicts, some Marine guards, and a handful of free settlers. They landed in the south at a place called Risdon Bay, and they immediately set up a colony. Now, had he been less impatient and conducted a little bit of due diligence on the viability of a settlement here, he would have realized that the location was vulnerable to changing tides, but he didn't, and the settlement became a disaster. Both the settlers and the convicts lost confidence in him, and just when it couldn't get any worse for him, Colonel David Collins, who had been based in Sydney, rocked up at Risdon Cove, took control of the settlement, and relocated it to the more sheltered Sullivan's Cove, about 5 kilometres south, with much more protection for the ships. More importantly, the location was right at the mouth of a fast-flowing stream that was fed by the waters of the melting slough off Table Mountain, which is now Mount Wellington, and this became to Hobart, today's city of Hobart. Again, as is the case throughout the whole of Australian history, the indigenous inhabitants of the local tribe here, who had been living here for something like 30,000 years, were totally overlooked. And as the last tents were being dismantled at Risdon Cove in preparation for the relocation, about 300 Aborigines out hunting in the hills, carrying little more than crude hunting spears and clubs, ran into and surprised a group of armed Marine sentries. How it all started is still disputed by historians and Aborigines, but what happened next was nothing short of a massacre, and this was one of the most violent conflicts between British forces and Australian Aborigines in the history of Australia. It was a catalyst for a complete breakdown in relations between the British settlers and the indigenous population, and it was escalated by some of the settlers simply taking over the Aborigines' hunting grounds as grazing grounds for their own stock. And it didn't help matters that some of them were also carrying away some of the Aborigine women, either, and the Aboriginal tribes really just wanted the settlers to take the sheep and cattle off the hunting grounds and leave. So they began spearing stock keepers on their property to try and get them out of the area, which backfired. In November 1826, Governor George Arthur issued a government notice declaring that colonists were free to kill any Aborigine who attacked a settler on their property. And the following 8 months, more than 200 Aborigines were killed in reprisal for the deaths of 15 colonists. And the toll kept rising, and this will go down in history as the Black War. In November 1830, Arthur organized a black line. He ordered every able-bodied male colonist to assemble at one of 7 designated places. The purpose was to join a massive drive to sweep the Aborigines out of the region and onto the remote Tasman Peninsula, far away from their homes and their traditional hunting grounds. The campaign failed, but the remaining remnants of the indigenous population were forced onto Flinders Island, and by now Tasmania's Aboriginal population had been reduced to about 300. With no immunity to the infectious diseases the Europeans brought, they quickly succumbed, reducing the population even further. And Truganini was the last living full-blooded Aborigine in Australia, and she died in 1876. The remote Tasman Peninsula was also chosen as the location of the notorious Port Arthur penal colony because of its remoteness from the rest of the island. Port Arthur became one of the harshest penal colonies in Australia. Long after the penal colony ceased to exist, the historic ruins became one of Tasmania's most visited tourist sites, attracting millions of visitors each year. And then it became cursed for a second time. It was the scene of Australia's deadliest mass shooting. This crazed gunman, Martin Bryant, went on a shooting rampage at the very popular tourist cafe within the grounds at Port Arthur. 53 people were killed, including women, children, and tourists from overseas. 20 more were seriously injured. He was eventually caught and sentenced to life imprisonment. But the fact that he had been able to drive a car and obtain a gun, despite having neither a driver's license nor a gun license, highlighted the inadequacy of the nation's gun laws. And it was a serious wake-up call for Australia and a pivotal point in changing the gun laws here. Then Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard, introduced the National Firearms Programme of 1996, and following advice, he addressed the crowds wearing a bulletproof vest, unprecedented in Australia's history. But he went on record last year, in October actually, saying that the biggest regret of his 11 years as Prime Minister was his decision to follow advice to wear that gun-proof jacket he wore, because he never felt unsafe in Australia and he thought it gave a bad message to everybody else. The government initiated a period of amnesty during this time. All illegal guns to be turned in, we got money for it, cash back payment, no questions asked. Some like 650,000 firearms were handed in or peacefully seized, cost the government $350 million. This was funded by a temporary increase in the Medicare levy that we all paid a few dollars a bit more for, and I don't think anybody in the country objected to paying those few dollars, because we have never had another incident like that since. The following year, Tasmania was the first state to apologize to the Aboriginal community over its involvement in what's known as the notorious stolen generation of Aboriginal children. These were half-caste or lightly tanned Aboriginal children. They were forcibly removed and cut off from their families to be raised in institutions, fostered out or adopted out to white families. And the whole idea was to erase their Aboriginality, as it was put. And this here is a scene on one of the clocks, animated clocks in the Queen Victoria building in Sydney. The early days of settlement in Australia were not really a good period in Australia's history, and as I said before, you only have to scratch the surface, and there's a very tragic underbelly of what happened in the years, but we can't turn the clock back. The Rabbit-Proof Fence, if you're interested in a movie that's a little bit more about the stolen generation, this is a very good movie exactly on that subject. So Tasmania hit the world media again in 2006 when the Beaconsfield mine, not too far from Burnie, collapsed following a minor earthquake, killing one of the miners and trapping 2 miners underground. The whole of Australia sat glued to the TVs night after night after night as this rescue seemed to go on forever. Eventually, it took a fortnight to get these 2 guys rescued from that mine. And one of Australia's famous sons and daughters hails from Tassie. It's Mary Donaldson. She went on to become the Crown Princess Mary of Denmark after she met Prince Frederick in Sydney during the Olympic Games. So welcome to Tasmania and welcome to Burnie. The Port of Burnie is Tasmania's largest general cargo port, and it's the nearest Tasmanian port to Melbourne on the Australian mainland. Small town of Burnie began life in the 1800s as Emu Bay. The rich tin deposits were discovered about 40 miles south of the town at a place called Mount Bischoff. At the time, it was the richest tin mine in the world. About the same time, more rich mineral deposits were discovered on the west coast, so when Abel Tasman blamed those minerals for affecting his compass, he wasn't too far wrong. When Burnie Tin Mine was operated, it was operated by the Van Diemen's Land Company. They immediately realized the potential and benefits of the mineral boom it could bring to the small town of Burnie. And because it was the nearest deep water port to anywhere at the time, so they transferred the headquarters there. They needed some sort of transport to it. They built a very small tramway. It was built to run the 71 kilometres from Emu Bay to Mount Bischoff to the mines. It was a fairly primitive horse-drawn tram running on a wooden tramway, and it was eventually replaced with steel rails to allow the steam locomotives. Burnie's famous lactose cheese factory, it was established in the 1950s by a Czech refugee called Milan Vilanek. He was a dairy technologist, and his name is associated with being the first person to produce the specialty European cheeses for the ready market of Australia's new migrant population, who were not really interested in the bog standard regular old cheddar. It took him a couple of attempts to get this cheese factory up and running. His first attempt failed because the butter factories opposed him getting a license, but he found a way around it by using the license and surplus milk of Better Milk at Burnie. This allowed him to lease the land next door, and now with a license and land, he started production in 1955. And through his skills in clever marketing, he brought lactose cheese into the largest manufacturer and overseas exporter of specialty cheeses. Some years back, the Heritage Company was bought over by Lion Cheese, and they have since taken it to new heights. For 75 years, Burnie was known for its production of paper, and the paper mill was known as the pulp. It used the natural timber resources around Burnie to produce this paper, and the impact of the paper industry on the small seaside town was dramatic. It turned Burnie from a sleepy little town into a booming industrial pulp and paper town. And in the 8 years, from 1937 to 1945, Burnie's population more than doubled from 4 to 10,000. Despite Burnie's heavy industrial past, today, in the past decade or so, it has reinvented itself as a creative city on a beautiful stretch of Tasmania's northwest coast. It's not big. It has a population of about 20,000, but its draw card is that it's Tasmania's gateway port to the spectacular Cradle Mountain. So a little bit out of town, there's a hill called Round Hill. There's a lookout out here with some great views back down over the port. I don't know who these people are, but I got the picture off of TripAdvisor because I wanted to get a picture of this. This is the Wilfred Campbell Memorial up here. The words obnoxious odour and polluted air, it's not something you'd expect on a lookout memorial in town, but it has a twist. The memorial was erected in memory of the bad old days when Burnie was choking on pollution and Tasmania was Australia's most polluted city. Today, Tasmanians are intensely proud of the huge improvements they've made in the last few years, and in no small way, thanks to those greenies. Now, stepping into Burnie Regional Museum is like going back a few years in time. There's a photographic collection in here called the Winter Collection. There's about 300,000 photographic negatives in here of the region's history caught on camera, captured over more than 90 years from 3 generations of the Winter family. When I saw Winter Collection, I mistook it, thinking it was a seasonal exhibition. It's not. Winter's the guy's name. There's an exhibit in here to the Emu Railway that contributed significantly to the economic prosperity. There's some very old photos of the Associated Pulp and Paper Mills, so the APPM, and the impact it had on Burnie's growth. Part of the exhibition in here is called Federation Street. We've got some mock-up stores featuring a trade or a profession that was important in a pioneering community. Each store is based on an actual store that existed in that time. There's lots of interesting objects and items here and photos on display. And I recognize a bottle of 47 cologne because my mother used to use that all the time. The whole focus on this museum, the regional museum, is on how ordinary people lived and died in Burnie in this round about the 1900s in these harsh pioneering days, sort of like from the cradle to the grave kind of journey. It's in there. It's very good. It's worthwhile doing. Burnie Regional Art Gallery or BRAG, B-R-A-G for short, has over 1,000 works in its collection. Right from its early beginning, it began acquiring finest examples in the fields of drawing and printmaking and photography, featuring works on paper in recognition of Burnie's strong historical presence in the papermaking industry. And this gallery today attracts the works of many well-known Australian and overseas artists as well. Burnie has some very charismatic old architecture, and you can do a self-guided walk around Burnie city centre and the residential area with all these Federation-style buildings. You can get yourself a map with the history of the buildings from the Visitor Information Centre at Maker's Workshop. I think that walk takes about 20 or 30 minutes. Most of Burnie's beautiful Federation architecture was built during the days of the tin mines, and you can see the prosperity that those mines brought to the town. One of the most elegant buildings here is the old police station. This two-story brick Edwardian house with its magnificent ironwork around it. This was originally built as a family residence, which is why it looks more like a house today than a police station. And in 2010, Burnie changed forever when the pulp mill closed down. The industrial factory may be closed, but the city's association with the paper continues. The last owners of the pulp mine, of the paper production place, were called Paper Links, and they gifted the building to the community, dedicated to all of those workers who had toiled there over the years. And there's a paper mill trail you can follow, telling the 72 years history. The trail starts at the beach, directly opposite where the paper mill once operated. Goes about 600 meters, and the path unfolding ahead of you is meant to represent one long sheet of paper, reminiscent of a giant paper reel. And they say at the peak of production, this would have taken this big number 10 machine about 60 seconds to generate. And there's a number of interpretive signs along that trail as well. The local folks from Burnie are very proud of Maker's Workshop. This was opened in 2009 as part of an arts centre and part visitor information centre. It provides a one-stop shop for local artists and craftsmen to demonstrate their various skills. And creative paper is now part of the Maker's Workshop. There's a 30-minute interactive hands-on paper-making tour that focuses on using recycled waste sourced from the local farms, the industries, and from nature itself. A good example of creative use of paper is paper mache, which just goes to show you what you can do with some old newspapers, a large tube of glue and a few minutes of your time and a healthy smattering of maybe inspiration. Some of the natural fibers they use for making specialty paper is from plants like tree bark, lavender plants, and beer hops. None of these is particularly creative, but they also make it from roo poo. And I don't know why you would choose to make any paper out of roo poo, but there you are, they do it. Maybe the interactive hands-on class will give you a heads up, and then you can make your own version at home. Don't worry, if you don't have a kangaroo, you can make it from, I'm sure you can make it from other types of animals as well. Just make sure if you're making it yourself, you don't get your blenders mixed up. The countryside around Burnie is prime dairy country, and Burnie is renowned for its dairy farms, and it's a really good opportunity here to sample some of the cheeses that are produced in Tasmania, particularly the creamy camemberts and the sharp cheddars. Those are my favorites, but Lion Cheese, who bought out the Lactose Cheese Factory, has a cheese shop at Maker's Workshop, and that's where it's part for all these artisans and also the information centre. And they have a range of dairy products for tasting and also for purchase. I really like this photograph because I like my cheese strong enough that it actually walks up to the table on its own. But Maker's Market, I've mentioned a few times, is a visitor centre. Here, it's right in front of the beach seafront, with great views from its cafeteria. It spreads out onto the boardwalk. And you can go for a jog or a walk along here after you've tasted all these cheese samples to kind of work it off. Right next to the boardwalk is Burnie's contribution to Australia's big things. They have the big octopus, or octopuses, or octopi, whatever you want to call them, and they're just outside that boardwalk there at the information centre. With Burnie's great dairy industry, excellent cream and butter, it's no surprise that they have a chocolate factory down here. I think I read somewhere that there's a tour of this factory, and you can see the techniques of making chocolate. And then there's some sample. And when I was putting this lecture together, I noticed that we were talking about truffles. We talk about truffles, we talk about chocolate truffles, because it's quite a famous thing here. And then I realized they were talking about a tour to the lower Barrington wine region to meet a truffle farmer and her truffle dogs. and experience a hunting dog demonstration, how the dog sniffs this out. And I'm sincerely hoping that those are truffles that I'm showing you here in front of that little dog. Now, I'm from Scotland, the land of malt whisky, so it pains me somewhat to tell you that Burnie has its own malt whisky distillery down here, Helios Road Distillery. It's been around for a while, since 1999, when the first barrel of malt was rolled out. In 2010, the Helios whisky won the award for the best Australian malt whisky. I emphasize Australian malt whisky. And clearly this is something I need to do some more independent research on, but this is quite famous down here. So the next few attractions I'm going to mention now are just a little bit out of town. Stanley, it's a historic little village outside Burnie. It was once the administration centre for the Van Diemen's Land Company, and it's nestled at the base of what's called Stanley's Nut, or Stanley Nut. It's a sheer-sided cliff or bluff, and that's all that remains of an ancient volcanic plug. And there's a walking track to the top, to the summit of the nut. It's not for the faint-hearted. It is pretty steep, but why walk up when you can go up in the chairlift? And those chairlifts look like typical ski lifts to me, and I'm not really big on heights, but it's got some amazing views from the top up here. You just don't want to be sitting next to me if we're going up in the same chair. But whatever mode of transport you take to get to the top, it's worth it for the views back across the Bass Strait benches and back down over town. There's a multi-winning Emu Valley rhododendron here, or the rhododendron garden. It's about 8 kilometres south of Burnie. It's recognised as one of Australia's major rhododendron gardens, and these slides are probably not doing it justice. Covers something like 11 hectares. It's got over 20,000 plants set into various countries in which each species of the wild rhododendrons originates. And I think some of you might be going here. It's quite spectacular, those gardens. They consist mainly of really rich volcanic soil that was never been farmed, and that's fed by several natural springs around here. There's landscape lakes, waterfalls, bridges, a handful of gazebos. And the gardens are actually classed as a plant museum to protect the plants that may become in danger, mostly due to human activity. Some of the local animals are in here. This is an echidna, and I'm showing you there. Burnie Park, don't be confused with the rhododendron gardens. It's about 1.5 kilometres out of town. It's quite a different setup. It's very small. It's more of a natural landscape of exotic and native trees. It's got the feel of an English countryside. But having said that, most of Tasmania does. If you're going more south from where we are, it begins to look like you're back in Lingdon. This has got this old world charm. It's very different from Australia with the dry sands and the red sands in the desert. So there's a short walk in here to Old Acre Falls inside this park. They're not the same category as Niagara Falls by any means, but they are in keeping with the park, and it's not that far from the tourist centre if you're just looking for something to do when you're in town. Fernglade Reserve is on the edge of the city. It's about 5 kilometres from Burnie. There's an interpretive trail in this reserve pointing out the interesting points on the flora and the fauna that you can see around there. There's a river running through here that it looks very dirty brown, but its staining is from the natural tannin. It seeps into the water, and these are the conditions that the native platypus thrive on. And this reserve is recognised as being one of the most reliable places that you might see the platypus, and you might see. You can't guarantee seeing them because this is not a zoo, but this is the environment that they live in. Now, the platypus is the animal that creation seemed to throw together at the last minute from bits and pieces left over from the other animals. They have a beak like a duck. They have webbed feet like a duck. They have a tail like an otter. And these are the real-life turduckens of the mammal world here. The platypus build their nests along the rivers. Being a mammal, they lay eggs, which turn into miniature turduckens. And no matter how cute they are, never try and pick one up because they have a hollow spur near their heel with poisonous glands. And it won't kill you, but it's mighty painful. So if you happen to be lucky enough to see one, just leave it where it is. There should be a lot of wildlife in here. You hear these kookaburras. I'm not sure if you've actually seen them around yet, but you hear them long before you see them because they've got the hysterical laugh. Now, this is a baby kookaburra, and I can understand now why the mother has that hysterical laugh when you look at that one. But you'll hear them. They're not tame, but they certainly will turn up when you least expect it, sitting on fences and whatever. Now, Guide Falls is about 20 minutes drive out of Burnie, a place called Wedge Ridley. The falls are quite small, but they're fairly impressive for their size. You need to have some sort of transport to get out here, or you may be picking up a small tour from town. But it's a favourite place here with that picnic spot with the locals at the weekend. Wings Wildlife Park has a motto that in the wild, only the fittest survive. But at Wings, every critter has a fighting chance. I'm not really sure how that upsets the balance of nature, but still. Wings claims to hold the largest collection of Tassie wildlife in Australia. And there's animals on their website I have never even heard of. Some of them look like these tiny marsupials that hop around like kangaroos. This is a boobook owl. There's crab-eating macaques, something that's called a quoll. A long-nosed pottery, and I hope they've got them all in the right sequence here. And hopefully somewhere along our itinerary up to this point, you've had an opportunity to see some of our local wildlife up close and personal, including this little guy here. Hopefully you haven't been attacked by our mosquitoes or sandflies that are big enough in some areas that will simply carry you away with them. The animal that everybody comes to Tasmania to see is the Tasmanian devil, or the Tassie devil. And they would have to be the angriest little critters on the planet. They are forever screaming and howling and fighting with each other. And the reason they're screaming and fighting with each other is to scare off male suitors to safeguard their female partner's fidelity. So you'll probably hear them and you'll definitely smell them long before you actually see them. These are carnivorous little guys. They're the size of a small dog. They are the world's largest mammal, and they were once native also to the mainland, but now you only find them in Tasmania. And they think they disappeared from the mainland because they were becoming prey to the dingoes. But it's hard to imagine them becoming prey to anything. They're just so fierce-looking. There's a couple of interesting facts about them. If you see them sneezing, this is part of their fighting strategy, and they store fat in their tail as an emergency reserve here. But since the late 1990s, their population has been drastically reduced due to this facial tumour disease that's decimating their numbers. The government of Tasmania has set up programs to try and reduce the impact of this disease, and since 2013, healthy devils are again being sent to zoos around the world as part of the Australian government's Save the Tassie Devil program. So this is the best place to see them. They became the symbol of Tasmania since becoming worldwide attention through the Looney Tunes character that appears on telly. Guns Plains Caves are about 45 minutes or an hour's drive inland from Burnie. They were discovered in 1906 by a guy called Bill Woodshouse. This is not him, I just needed a picture. Apparently he was out hunting possums, and as the story goes, the possum he was chasing eluded him by diving down a large hole in the ground. Apparently he followed the possum and the hole led him directly to the cave. Possums are protected species in Australia, but they're not protected in New Zealand, because they make possum gloves. But in Australia, you cannot do anything about a possum. So the earliest tourists needed to descend 3 stories to the cave floor by rope. All that has changed. You no longer have to lower yourself through the cave at the end of a long rope. There are now 54 concrete steps leading down into the cave. The section of the cave it's open to the public. It's about 275 meters long. It's well lit, fairly easy walk. Just remember there are 54 steps. Candles and torchlight have since been replaced with power lighting and throughout the cave to provide better lighting for the walking track and to highlight the cave's unique features. It's quite spectacular. It has some amazing formations. It has this naturally formed vaulted ceiling down here, stalagmites, stalactites. Like all limestone caves, it's been worn away by a stream running through it over the centuries. The stream is probably, most of it is still here, and it's home to fish and small eels. Caves are usually cool, and the floor is usually slippery, so if you're going on this tour, you just might want to throw on a sweater and just make sure you wear some sensible shoes while you're down there. Now, Tarkine Forest Adventure, a dismal swamp, is different in a very wacky sort of way, and this is just the reception area. Then in itself is an award-winning structure. I have never heard of this place, but I saw it advertised on one of your tours, and I checked the website. It's quite new. This is the reception. It's perched at the end of what's called Dismal Swamp Sinkhole, and this is the largest sinkhole in the southern hemisphere. And the complex is also home to, it's an ecotourism, primarily ecotourism. It's home to these natural blackwood forests that you can take a walk through. The website says there's lots of wildlife living in here, but given the weird aspect of this sinkhole, I can only imagine that anything in here would be somehow genetically modified. But there's a giant, here's the kicker, there's a giant 110-meter slide that you can slide down. Now, I think this is optional on the tour. I don't think it's obligatory. But if any of you do it, I really would like some photos from you here. This thing, you hurtle down here, lying on your back, right through the canopy of the trees, and exhilarating speeds. And I read you can be doing 100 Ks at one time. It sounds like a lot of fun. I don't know how you can possibly do that because you're lying on your back, hurtling down through that thing. But that's a new experience, and I saw that it's on there as well. Now, here's another one of our sounds. So the next lot now, and it's coming up to one of the last ones, is the undisputed diamond and Tassie's crown. This is the beautiful Cradle Mountain, and this is the reason that we come to Burnie. Burnie has a few attractions in and around town, but they're not really mind-shattering, but this one probably is. So Burnie has the honor of being the gateway to Cradle Mountain, and it's only 60 kilometers drive out of town. Cradle Mountain sits in the middle of Lake St. Clair World Heritage National Park, and Lake St. Clair is a national freshwater lake with an area of approximately 45 square kilometers. Maximum depth of about 160 meters, making it Australia's deepest lake. Cradle Mountain rises very majestically above this, and it's one of the principal tourist sites in Tasmania. It's about 1,500 meters, or about 5,000 feet above sea level, and it's the 5th highest mountain in Tasmania. The mountain actually has 4 peaks. Cradle Mountain itself is named after this contraption, which is a miner's cradle. You kind of need to have a little bit of imagination here, and that's where the name came from. There's a road that runs around the mountain called the Overland Track. It winds through different landscapes for about 80 kilometers. The full hike takes about 6 to 8 hours, and it rests as being a hiker's paradise. It's not my idea of paradise. Suggest you don't try this one on a one-day visit, but don't be disheartened because there are many walks in Cradle Mountain of varying durations and much shorter walks. And when you get there, the tourist center is as far as buses and cars go and tourist buses can go. And I guess if you're on the ship's tour, these options are usually explained to you here with where you can go on short walks, get advice on maps. One of the most popular shortest walks is called Enchantment Walk. It's really beautiful. It's through this very heavily covered in moss, and it's not hard to understand why it's called Enchantment Walk. It looks a little bit, these are King Billy pines. It looks like something out of a Hobbit movie. And there's a stunning Tasmanian snow gums. These magnificent colors appear as the bark peels off, and these are actual colors. They're not dotted in any way at all. And the pencil pines, you get a lot of these trees growing up in the, because I ski a lot, up in the snowy mountains. In amongst the snow, you'll get these beautiful trees with these incredible colors when the bark peels off. And this is Pencil Pine Falls. So the vegetation around here is alpine and subalpine, beautiful mosses, very, very dense mossy undergrowth, typical alpine flowers. Again, they change with the seasons. Keep your eyes open for big holes around here, because these will be openings to the wombat's burrows. And this is a good place to see them. That's a wombat, and they lumber around, and I mean lumber around. They're very slow. They grow quite big, and they're a nightmare on country roads because they sort of lumber across in the dark and you can't see them. Dove Lake is a glacial lake that features on all of Cradle Mountain tourism posters, and it usually includes this old boat shed. The weather here is very changeable. It's very unpredictable. The sky is not always that color of blue. Quite often it's that color as well. It's a bit like Scotland. It can get quite misty. Cradle Lodge, or now Pepper's Cradle Lodge it's called, is like an elegant old hunting lodge here, which is very popular with day trips from Burnie. Quite often this is where some of the tourists come to for lunch coming up from Burnie. Now we're on the home run. So if none of the above appeal to you at all, downtown Burnie is not a big place. It does have a couple of good pubs, and that's my friend who asked me earlier on, in the beautiful heritage style of buildings here, so you could convince yourself that you're actually doing a Federation walk and not really a pub crawl. I'm not going to list them all, or you'll be wondering how come I know, but it's very pretty. Some of those buildings are really very pretty. Now, Burnie Port is Australia's 4th largest container seaport. It's a very busy working port, and whenever I've been here, and I checked with downstairs, and I also checked their website, you're not allowed to walk through the port area because there's cranes and machinery and all sorts of stuff going. And they send a shuttle bus, usually a comfortable shuttle bus, that picks you up and takes you. It will take you from the ship to Maker's Workshop. That's this one here, and that's the one I've mentioned throughout this talk. Maker's Workshop, it's the Information Tourist Centre as well. That bus, I can't guarantee this, but when I've been here, it also runs from the ship. It sometimes stops at the Burnie Regional Museum and then goes on to that. That we will find out when we're there as well. If you have friends meeting you in Burnie, it's better they meet you here, or if you've got a private tour, because they won't be allowed onto the pier at all. Nobody can walk. When we get there, there's always some tourist hosts and hostesses on the pier to help you out, but I notice you also always have one on board the ship. I have to show this slide about taking food off the ship. I took this one yesterday. They seem to be a bit more specific as to what you cannot take off the ship, but just don't take any fruit off the ship. Now, if you think this is bad, we can't take fruit between some of the states here because they don't want us taking the fruit fly from one state to another. So just make sure that you remember to check out the times of the last shuttle buses coming back to the ship. Again, we don't want you to miss the ship. So whatever it is you decide to do in Burnie, if you're on this tour, do not sit up on the way down through that big leather tube. Thank you very much for coming along. I have one more talk to go, and that's on Sydney, and that'll be the day before Sydney. So thank you, and good afternoon.